Hey, whiskey freaks, welcome back to the Blind Tasting Podcast, your number one attitudinal bourbon destination. I'm your host, John Stark, and today we're taking a little bit of a detour from our usual tastings. This is not a regularly scheduled episode. This is, I guess you would call it a bonus episode, really. Kind of a response to the recent news, and you know what I'm talking about. I think everybody's almost tired of hearing about it, but we've got to cover it today. The recent Jim Beam announcement that they're pausing distillation at their Claremont, Kentucky site for all of next year. Naturally, social media blew up, and by blew up, I mean supply chain experts came out of the woodwork. Everybody became their own personal economist and industry insider, and sometimes people got really nasty, and I'm talking about you up in Canada, folks. The people in Canada, I'm telling you. And it's so interesting because almost nobody in Canada listens to this podcast, but they had a lot of opinions, and well, there were a lot of people in America and across the world that had opinions as well. But the folks in Canada especially, they had a lot to say about us and, well, America in general. So here's what we're going to do today. I'm going to read some of these, let's call them ideas or misconceptions, or in a few cases, flat out wrong statements. And then Braden Stark, our resident financial and economics guru, is going to break them down with facts, context, and the reality behind all the speculation. Think of it as a social media fact check, just with bourbon involved. Now, full disclosure here before anybody loses their mind, Braden is my son. He's got a degree in finance, economics, and management, and he's currently working for a Fortune 250 financial services company. If you want stock tips, you ask Braden. If you want to know about interest rates or the economy, yeah, Braden. And today we're not talking vibes and hot takes. We're talking real numbers, we're talking data, and how the real world actually works. That's how we do it here. Now, his perspective is fresh, his thinking is sharp, and most importantly, he approaches every question with reason, logic, and imagine that, facts. Which, judging by some of the comments that we had on social media regarding the Jim Beam suspension, it might come as a bit of a shock. All right, Braden, let's get into it.
Awesome, I'm looking forward to it.
Are you ready to go into the abyss?
Let's do it.
All right, so first up, or our first comment or misconception, and I got to tell you, folks felt strongly about this one. I got a lot of, let's just say, hateful comments on this one. Everybody wanted to talk about Trump, and everybody wanted to talk about Biden and all the political things, but the bulk of the comments, they strongly believe this, guys. They say, Jim Beam is pausing production because of tariffs. They insist in less than civil terms, guys. These were we had some nasty comments here. They're insisting that tariffs are crushing Jim Beam and that these folks claim that is the reason Jim Beam is pausing production in Claremont, Kentucky. So what I want to know, Braden, what's really happening?
Well, it seems like what's happening at this moment is kind of maybe not even the final installment, but a continuing saga of a severe supply glut going on in the bourbon industry. It's really more of just a continuation of trends that were going on during COVID. As we've kind of talked about before, during COVID, production boomed, sales boomed. It was a real boom time for these companies, as a lot of people didn't have much else to do during the pandemic besides sit and drink whiskey. So these companies, as a lot of companies do, often make short-sighted decisions that include continuing production like this demand was going to last forever, like the pandemic demand was going to last forever. It's similar, as we've talked before, about the trends on work from home. People automatically assumed when people started working on Zoom that it was going to be that way forever. In-person work was dead. Nobody was ever going to go back to an office. Now you fast forward now, there is still some work from home, but most people are back in the office. And it's kind of the same thing with bourbon. People assumed that this drinking boom was going to last forever, that this bourbon boom was going to last longer term. And we've seen a sharp fall off in whiskey demand relative to pre-pandemic levels as people were forced to go back outside, go back to work, and the money that was kind of tossed out during COVID began to dry up. So it's really a fulfillment of these supply trends that we've been seeing and that has been talked about here on the Blind Tasting Podcast for years at this point.
Well, I appreciate that insight, Braden. So it simply just isn't tariffs. We can't just be yelling that word. It isn't one thing.
No, definitely not. And I'm not going to say tariffs played no part, but it wouldn't be surprising to me if they played less than 20%, right? If you wanted to do 100% causality, you could say probably 80% is just these longer term trends that we've been seeing, and probably 20% max is the impact of these tariffs, I'd say.
And a lot of these tariffs, from what I'm hearing, some of these tariffs are set to expire anyway, right? I mean, is it February? I don't know. I can't remember exactly because it is an ever-changing landscape involving tariffs. One day it's one thing, another day it's another, and I think that's fair to say. But I think some of these are expiring. Maybe others will come on. I don't know. It's very dynamic right now, but
It's all part of a strategy, and all of these deadlines. I'd say the uncertainty is probably the most frustrating part when it comes to these tariffs, but it's all part of seemingly Trump's plan to negotiate to get more out of his global partners. We'll see where it ends up, but it is such a changing situation that I think it does make it difficult for a lot of these bourbon producers to kind of forecast demand externally,
right? I mean,
across the globe.
Yeah, I mean, you're talking about a business that has to forecast 4, 5, 10, 15 years out. Again, they may have been a little short-sighted during COVID, or like you said, trusting that boom would continue. But again, now here they're pulling back, especially and we know that MGP's pulled back, and now it looks like Beam is pulling back a little bit too. So, is it cyclical? Is this a normal trend?
I mean, it's largely cyclical. You see these things all the times in lots of industries. You see it in memory chips, semiconductors, bourbon, any business that is kind of commoditized to a certain extent, right? I mean, obviously it's not like corn or wheat or anything like that, but obviously those go into bourbon. And when you're forecasting demand, and it's, again, particularly tough for bourbon companies because they have to make these decisions 4 or 5 years in advance, they can't automatically reduce or increase supply at any moment because they have their schedules and the things that they're aging at that moment. But you kind of see these things where demand is cyclical and these companies try to ride the wave the best they can, but it's just so difficult, especially when you're making forecasting decisions years in advance.
Okay. Well, I've got another one here. These comments were especially interesting, folks, and I'm grateful. Don't get me wrong, I'm grateful for the comments. And without these comments, we can't have a commentary. We can't go back and forth. We can't learn what everybody's thinking, right? But I think some people are thinking, like I said, some of these are misconceptions that I want to kind of straighten out today. And here's a spicy one. Quite a few folks, and let me be clear, it's actually lots of folks in Canada. They jumped into this conversation on social media when I simply posted my breaking news podcast segment. You should probably go back and listen to that. And I was announcing the big news about Jim Beam. And folks, I don't have any listeners in Canada. Yeah, I know. I don't have any. That's how much they don't care about bourbon and whiskey. And they don't care about this podcast. But they sure as hell cared about making comments about this breaking news segment. And let me tell you, no one in Canada listened to the breaking news episode. And it was one of my most listened to episodes on the podcast ever. In the United States, in Lithuania, in the United Kingdom, in Singapore, in Japan, in Germany, nobody in Canada listened to this episode. But they sure had a lot to say about it. And one of the things that they believe in Canada, apparently a lot of folks contend that because Americans under 30 aren't drinking whiskey, that's the main reason why Jim Beam is pausing production at the Claremont facility. And why is that? Well, they say it's because they're either smoking pot or they're drinking hard seltzers instead of whiskey. Now, like I said, I want to be respectful to y'all, but I think the issue is much deeper than folks smoking pot. Braden, who's right on this particular topic? Has everybody switched over to pot and White Claws?
No, I mean, that's quite the over-exaggeration. I mean, you are seeing a rise in alternatives. Like we mentioned, I think Trump just recently announced that marijuana was no longer going to be a Schedule A drug, or it did just become a Schedule A drug, something like that. There are the rise in alternatives. What we're seeing right now is much more short-term focused with, like we've mentioned, this massive supply glut that's been going on. I mean, I did some research into MGP's balance sheet, and they've had a large increase in inventory as a lot of the contract distillers that they're using are either going belly up or are slowing the rate at which they need this alcohol. So a lot of it's just sitting on MGP's balance sheet. So again, what we're seeing is much more short-term in nature. We are seeing some long-term slowdowns in bourbon that may be cause for alarm in future years. Like I said, there are a rise in alternatives, and it seems like a lot of people my age are pulling back on alcohol consumption as to a certain extent, a lot of social interaction. My generation is finding it much more difficult to have social interaction, and a lot of the social interaction that comes about just in general is going to a bar, drinking with friends, those kinds of things, which is leading to a slowdown in whiskey sales particularly. So again, there are some potential long-term headwinds here. It's nothing crazy, and it would by no means cause the closure of one of the biggest distilleries in the country. It would by no means cause that. There are some potential long-term headwinds, but again, nothing that would cause a response of this magnitude from Jim Beam, as no one is ringing the alarm bells about long-term supply just yet, long-term demand. But there are some short-term supply issues that Jim Beam is addressing with this closure.
Right. And, there's a couple reasons they say, and some of this is still to be determined. And I find it hard to believe. But the first thing that I do believe is that Jim Beam said that one of the reasons they're pausing the Claremont operation is to actually upgrade the facility. I think it's one of the older distilleries in America, or that particular facility. So I think that's part of what they're doing. They've not announced any layoffs, which I think is strange. I know that it takes more than a couple people to run an entire monstrous sized distillery that makes hundreds of thousands of barrels of whiskey every year. So I find it hard to believe that no one's losing their job. Maybe they'll do a good job moving them around, shuffling them to other distilleries that Jim Beam has relationships with. But on that same track, a lot of folks were saying that Jim Beam stock, this is somebody actually made this comment, and it pains me to say it, but somebody actually said Jim Beam stock is plunging. Clearly, the company is failing. So there's a couple things wrong with that. I'm going to let Braden explain. And this person, another one of our good Canadian friends, who does not even listen to the podcast, we went back and forth a time or two on this one. I would try to explain with logic and reason and facts why that didn't make any sense. I really didn't get anywhere, though. Like I said, I really do value the discussion, but sometimes facts are just facts. We can't let our feelings get involved, our politics get involved, and as pissed off as I'm sure some people in Canada are that they can't get our delicious bourbon from the United States anymore, or that people are choosing not to get it up in Canada, I get that, but we've got to focus on the facts. Here's something else. Some dude said, blaming your bad product, meaning Jim Beam whiskey, on a tariff is comical. Jim Beam stock has been plunging for a few years now. Welcome to capitalism. So this was super hard for me to pass up. There's just so much wrong here. Braden, can you help a brother out here? What exactly is wrong with this particular take on the Jim Beam pause?
Well, specifically with Jim Beam, I'd say the biggest problem with this comment is that Jim Beam is not a public company. It's privately held and therefore doesn't have a stock price. Now, I'm not saying Jim Beam hasn't been going through some hard times, and if it did have a stock, it would most likely be down along with all the other public companies like MGP and Brown-Forman, but it just doesn't have a stock, and again, it may not be this big alarm that this commenter is making. As you mentioned, they're making upgrades to the facility. It's not all just the company is failing, the sky is falling. This commenter does seem to be a little bit on the angrier side when it may not be all that the headline is chalked up to be.
So this next misconception, I'm going to call it, we get to deal with today is, okay, remember guys, these comments all grew out of a post I put on social media announcing that Jim Beam has paused production in Claremont. Keep that's a frame of reference here, guys. So the next idea, and this came from another one of our good Canadian friends. I hate to pick on you, but this guy was super, super fired up and, well, also super wrong. He said, wait for it, Crown Royal, the Canadian whiskey, is the top-selling whiskey in the United States, despite the tariffs. And look, I'm not bashing Crown. I mean, who doesn't mind a Crown and Coke, right? But we got to look at facts. Braden, can you help me out here? Yeah,
I mean, it's just not. It's great in Canada and a lot of Canadian, it's big for Canada, but it's just not that in the U.S. Jim Beam White Label is the largest sold whiskey in the United States, and it's not particularly close when it comes to Crown Royal specifically. But yeah, the tariffs definitely did not help a Canadian whiskey in the United States, that's for sure. And this commenter isn't right. I will point out that I think our Canadian friends are thinking more about their own problems, right? For example, the tariffs have been particularly felt in Canada. For example, American spirit exports in Canada plunged by 85% in Q2 of 2025 relative to last year, where in U.S. whiskey exports in total to all other countries dropped only 9%. So our Canadian friends, I think, are using their personal experience, and they are kind of pushing that to the rest of the world and assuming that all other United States whiskey exports are facing the decline that they have in Canada, where that's not necessarily the case. I think our Canadian friends have just kind of taken it personally and kind of pushed their experience onto the rest of the world, because they're not wrong about how things are in Canada necessarily, but extrapolating to the whole world is kind of where their logic meets its end, I'd say.
Okay, yeah, makes sense. I think everybody wants to look at things from their own perspective, from their own house. Once you get outside your house and look around a little bit, maybe your perspective would change.
Yeah, exactly. Right?
So, of all the comments that were wacky, to say the least, this was the least wacky, and it's really almost insightful and thoughtful. This cat, he a bit misguided, but still a decent stab at the problem. This is a dude from the United States. He may even be a listener. I thank you for listening. I appreciate that. He took a decent stab at the problem, in my opinion. This dude says the bourbon boom left too much inventory, and now all distilleries are struggling. All distilleries. Raiden?
I mean, this is a pretty decent take, right? You've seen a lot where sales have fallen for the majority of distilleries over the past couple years, and these inventories that these companies have really built up. For example, the analysis that I did on MGP in particular is pretty startling. They've had the inventory to sales ratio, which has inventory on the numerator, sales on the denominator, is really an idea of how inventories are moving relative to sales. The idea is if your inventories are climbing relative to sales, you may have a harder time getting rid of your inventory, and then that may cause inventory write-offs, and it may put you in more of a bind as far as financially would go. And MGP in particular has had a bit of a trouble with this ratio. They've had a much higher ratio over the past couple years. The ratio has climbed up to 0.66. So for every 66 cents of inventory, they have $1 of sales. And you're starting to get into sort of a trouble area when your inventories are rising much faster than sales, because people begin to wonder, are you going to be able to get rid of that? Are you going to be able to sell that inventory? Now, bourbon faces some unique benefits relative to other industries. For example, you can just kind of leave it in the barrel. You can keep it aging. A lot of companies, when their inventory ages, it gets worse in quality. It becomes harder to sell, right? If the iPhone 15 doesn't sell, by the time Apple releases the iPhone 16, the 15 is obsolete and nobody's going to buy it anymore. Yeah. Bourbon has a unique advantage in this, where longer aged whiskey is actually higher quality. But you do eventually run into some issues where some of the whiskey gets absorbed into the barrel and you lose ounces.
Some of those profiles.
Yeah.
And then the angel share, right? The longer it sits, the more you lose, right?
Yeah, exactly. So you're going to run into those problems. Bourbon has some unique benefits in relative to letting that inventory age, but it does ring some questions as that inventory is rising, but sales start falling. If these companies are going to be able to sell that inventory, and inventory isn't worth anything if you're not able to sell it. So some of these companies may run into some hardships soon. Again, it's hard to say every single distillery is going through problems. It's probably pretty close. This has been a broad-based decline across the inventory, but this commenter does hit it pretty good on the head here, I'd say.
So I think this was probably the most disheartening comment that I had in this thread, right? Where I just mentioned that Jim Beam was going to pause production for a year. And I'd like to think that you whiskey freaks would never talk like this. I mean, we're really a fun-loving bunch, right? Just give me a pour, put me out on the patio, set me poolside with the bourbon. I'm pretty happy, right? But sadly, there are some really, really nasty people out there. I would say this is the opposite of humanity here, this comment. And an actual human being actually said this. Wah, wah, wah. Are those who voted Republican finally getting the message? Somebody else said along the same lines here, and this is no joke, guys. They really said this. Citizens in a ruby red state, that means Kentucky, are getting exactly what they voted for and what they deserve. I love to see this. So let me break this one down before I throw it over to you, Braden. These people are saying Republicans in Kentucky created this mess and they deserve it. Guys, this is not a political podcast. We deal in facts here, not feelings or not how you vote. We're not. This isn't red or blue. I got to ask you though, Braden, did Republicans cause the downturn in bourbon and whiskey and cause Jim Beam to pause production for a year?
No, I don't think that's fair to say. Again, the most you can pin on quote-unquote Republicans would be the Trump tariffs, which we've kind of talked about, have played a role, but it's been much more of a marginal role. I also don't think anyone really expected Trump to go this far with some of the tariffs that he's done. So again, I don't think it's fair to blame the Republicans or these particular voters in Kentucky. It's obviously never good to see economic activity slow down. Potentially, like you mentioned, nobody's lost their job yet, but heaven forbid there's no job cuts. Again, it's much more systemic than just how someone voted, pretty much, and what we're seeing in the bourbon industry, and it's largely unfair to blame, quote, Republicans for what's been going on.
I mean, that's exactly right. And the whiskey, it doesn't care who you voted for. It's not a Democrat or a Republican. And I think the numbers that we've talked about today, they speak for themselves. Okay, so on to my last comment, misconception, question, idea. And I'm going to start wrapping this up today. Let's talk specifically, and I know you've touched tangentially on this. That's a big word for those of you with an infinity bottle. That means we almost... I'm not going to say that.
It's kind of funny, though.
And we did talk tangentially about stock prices, touch the edges there with MGP and Brown-Forman. But I want to talk about stock prices directly because some folks pointed to stock prices for the decline, and they said absolute proof that bourbon is, in their words, collapsing. So I want to look at the numbers today, and that's why Braden is here. That's another reason Braden is here today. Braden, can you kind of give us a quick hit of stock data and break that down from that perspective, please?
Yeah, so I think the first thing that when it comes to stock prices is, yes, these stock prices have, if you want to put it that way, collapsed. Brown-Forman and MGP have both been down around 70% from their peaks back in 2021. But the important thing to know about stock prices is they are an effect rather than a cause. Your stock price going down does not mean that your business is failing. Your business is failing causes your stock price to go down. So the stock price is more of an effect rather than a cause. And the other thing is a stock price is also kind of a bet on future expectations, right? As the supply glut continues to drag on and these companies aren't really seeing any way out of it, right? There's no real no real end in sight as inventories continue to rise and sales continue to flatline or even in most cases go down. So a lot of investors are seeing this supply glut continue and they're not seeing an end in sight. So these bets that people are making is that the stock price is going to keep falling as this supply glut continues to get worse and worse. So stock prices are more of an effect than anything. And again, we're seeing this across pretty much all the business. There's no one business. Some businesses are handling it better than others, but it is a broad-based bourbon decline. But again, it's just bets on the future and how people think the supply glut is going to end, as well as a little bit mixed in about the long-term demand, which we've already talked about.
So full disclosure, I always want to say that I don't want to be sued, by the way. I do own shares of MGP stock as well as Brown-Forman. I dollar cost average that. What that means is every month or every week or every so often on a regular basis, I put money into those stocks. I continue to put money into those stocks despite the fact that they're down an incredible amount especially over the last year, but over the last several years. This podcast is obviously not stock advice. Don't do what I do. Do your own research. But that's what I do, so I wanted to disclose that at least. And I also wanted to say that there's no need to panic. Am I right? There's no need to panic at this point?
No, there's no real need. There's no need to panic. There's cause for alarm, right? I did some research into MGP's balance sheet, and it has deteriorated a little bit, but it's also not on the verge of bankruptcy by any means. Like no one's saying like, oh, these companies are about to go out of business. Obviously, the outlook for some of these companies has worsened, and that's why the stocks have gone down. But these companies aren't in bankruptcy risk, right? Most of these companies, especially these big ones, MGP, Brown-Forman, these bigger companies should be able to weather the supply glut that's going on. It's just, it's going on, I think, longer than people expected, and there's really no end in sight at the moment. But these companies are huge mega companies. They're going to be fine. Bourbon is not going to disappear. It's just a decent downturn for an industry that's kind of got a hangover from COVID.
Well said.
Thank you.
So, Whiskey Freaks, what have we learned today? Well, I think we've learned that Jim Beam's pause in production is a normal market adjustment. It's not a scandal, guys. It's not a political scandal. And we've also learned that stock movements reflect expectations. It's not affecting the quality of the whiskey in your glass. So don't panic.
If anything, it's making the quality in your glass better as these companies have to release longer aged bourbons to try and sell some of their inventory. I know you've talked
That's
about
true.
this.
Yeah, it is absolutely. You see more limited editions, higher age statements. Then you think about Jim Beam. They just came out with Knob Creek 21.
Yeah, Knob Creek 21.
Yeah,
so if anything, it's actually making the quality in your glass better.
Jack Daniel's released their oldest whiskey ever, I think, the 14-year last year. And I think they've got plans to introduce a 16-year soon. So, yeah, I think we're all going to actually benefit from some of this downturn. It's sad. I mean, we hate to see people potentially lose their jobs, and we hate to see people struggling. But we may benefit from it. So at least there's that. So I guess in closing today, I just want to say, before you believe all these crazy claims online, check the facts and the data. That's what we're doing today. We're looking at facts. We're looking at data. Going out there and spewing bourbon bullshit, it doesn't help anybody. So let's drink and discuss this stuff responsibly. And guys, let's try to be a bit more kind to one another. I hate this phrase, but we're all in this together. Remember that? Remember that bullshit they told us? We're all in this together, guys. Let's try to play nice. So look at the facts, understand the trends, and enjoy your whiskey without panic. Well, Braden, thanks for setting things straight today. It's always good to have a pro kind of cut through the noise and the bullshit. And thank you, the listeners, for joining us as we delve into the abyss of social media and the wonderful world of whiskey. Don't forget to subscribe on all the things, guys. The YouTube, the Spotify, the Apple, the iHeart. You can find us everywhere. Blind Tasting Podcast. Help us keep this thing blowing up. Braden, thanks for being with us today.
Thank you for having me.
And thank you all for listening to the Blind Tasting Podcast, your #1 attitudinal bourbon destination.